Please be seated. When I was growing up, it was the early days of computers, and so there were, I think, 3 in my entire elementary school back then. And they lived on carts in the hallway so they could move easily between the classrooms. And the best thing was when the teacher said it was your turn to go out and work on the computer. And the number one thing you could do on the computer back in the 80s was play the Oregon Trail game. Now, they say that's a game to teach the history of what the settlers went through as they traveled on the Oregon Trail. I think it was really secretly designed to teach children how to despair. If you don't know the game well, or you didn't get a chance to play it, I know many of you probably had kids that played it, you get to choose at the beginning who your character is. You get some resources to buy the things you're going to need for the journey. You have to choose between horses or oxen. How much food do you take? How many boxes of bullets do you take? How much medicine do you buy? And then as the game goes on, you make choices every stage of the way. You get to determine how much you eat, or how fast you go, or when you decide to use your medicine. But it's not a traditional game like we would become used to in the Nintendo world, where there were levels that you go level 1, level 2, level 3. It was a linear game with progress, and you either made it to Oregon or you died. And the game was full of all sorts of ways to kill you. So if you got bit by a snake, you died. If you ran out of food, you died. If you got sick with a fever or the flu or dysentery, you died. If you weren't good at hunting, or you were hunting and got shot, you died. If you broke your leg, you were probably going to die. If your wagon broke and you couldn't fix it, or your ox died and you couldn't get another one, you died. If the weather was bad enough, you got hypothermia, you died. And the worst part of the game was that every once in a while you had to cross a river, and those were really treacherous, and you always had to navigate, do I go out of the way and travel longer and maybe run out of resources, or do I try to caulk my wagon and float it across the river? And so ultimately you learn that you need to try to get over the rivers. And it'll show you this little cheesy graphic, because the graphics weren't good. We're talking a little floppy disk like this in those days. So it's getting almost there, and every time you get your hopes up that you're going to make it, but more often than not, your wagon tips over before it gets across, and you lose bullets and clothes and food. The end result often means that, if not right away, down the road, you die. I played this game probably in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, and I don't remember anybody making it to Oregon. I certainly never did. But I still have fond memories of that game. Now, the game was historically accurate. It was actually created originally by a history teacher who wanted his students to understand what it was like. The version that I knew had been redone in 1980 to make it graphic. It had only been a text game when it first came out. But there was a UGA grad, actually, who was tasked to create this graphic version that millions of people in my generation would go on to play. And the only thing I can think, although it was accurate, the Oregon Trail history is dark, so the game is dark. But it also could be that back in the 70s, going back into the 60s, UGA was losing to Alabama quite frequently. And I know what that does to people here when that happens. So I'm just saying maybe that rivalry speaks to why Gen X is the way that it is. I'm just saying that might have had a bigger impact than we think. It was still a fun game nonetheless. And as I think about the man in the gospel today who kneels in front of Jesus, it seems to me that he's got a little bit of the Oregon Trail spirit in him. So he has this idea of the promised land he wants to get to. He wants to get to eternal life. And he knows some of what he has to do. He knows he's kept the laws, he's done the things or not done the things that the laws might require of him. And yet there's still some gap that he's not sure how to finish this journey and rest assured that he has eternal life. And so Jesus says, well, you're missing one thing. You need to go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor. And it says that the man went away from Jesus grieving because he had many possessions. And then Jesus, as he often does, to our dismay, makes his lesson a little bit harder as he talks to the disciples. Because he says to them, basically with the story about the camel and the eye of the needle, it's going to be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. And the disciples immediately know what a high bar Jesus has just set by saying that. Because they recognize that when you talk about wealth and whether somebody's rich, it's a relative term. And so even for them, they're concerned. We know there's people worse off than us. And you hear that lament. Then who can possibly be saved? The man who triggered this lesson probably has a lot more than them, but they realize they might not even make it under Jesus's criteria. This is one of those gospel passages that when I read it, it makes me squirm. I'm sure I'm the only one here who feels this way when we hear it, too. Now, I recently rewatched one of the Yellowstone prequels, 1883. I think most of you know of the Yellowstone television show starring Kevin Costner. It's a modern Western that tells the story of the fictional Dutton family and their massive ranch out in Montana. The show was so popular, it had a couple of prequel spin-offs, one of which was 1883, where you meet some of the Dutton family ancestors, played by Tim McGraw and Faith Hill. And you start the series in Texas, where they have come to begin their journey to their promised land in Oregon, where they hear there is a wonderful life and land waiting for them. And they fall in with one of these covered wagon trains. They don't intend to join one, but through circumstances, they meet up with Sam Elliott, the wagon train boss for this group of immigrant travelers, and they begin the journey together. Right away, we realize that this immigrant group who has come to America to start a new life is not prepared for the journey ahead. They don't have the equipment, they don't have the mindset, they don't have the skill sets they're going to need, but they try it anyway. And it's like the writers of the show must have played the game, because they're not even out of Texas and people are dying. Snake bite in the butt, you die. Broken leg, you die. You got a fever, you die. And there's all these people on this journey who are dying left and right in every episode. It is not the most feel-good show of all the shows you might watch. There's a lot of suffering. But in one scene, partway through the series, they come to their first river crossing. Remember I said how dangerous those were in the game? Well, that's because they were dangerous in real life. And the trail boss is frustrated because he realizes just how overladen these wagons are. They're never going to be able to ford this river. And when he sees one of the wagons has a piano in the back of it, he loses it. And he says, I told you when we were in Fort Worth, if it is not absolutely necessary, it does not make the trip. And the guy who's kind of the leader for the wagon train says, well, it's essential for him. He's a musician. And Sam Elliott's character is mad, and he says, no, he is not a musician. And you are not a carpenter, and you are not a blacksmith. You are pioneers, and that's all that you are until you get there. You have no home, you have no job, you have no farm. You have the journey. That's it. I think, wow, that's quite a realization for these folks. Now rewind with me just a week. If you read the epistle, I don't know that we read the epistle last week. I think we might have read the first lesson in this service. But the epistle from the Hebrews that we were reading had a verse in it that describes Jesus as the pioneer of our salvation, perfected in suffering. And with that ringing in my head when I read today's gospel, I can see where what's happening is Jesus is saying, those of you who are going to take this journey with me, in essence, need to have the mindset of pioneers, including the suffering that comes with it. Now, if you think about this gentleman that we saw in the gospel, he was not a bad guy. That wasn't his issue. He was following the law. He was doing all the things that he was supposed to do. He was probably a good person. But it's also clear that he was weighed down by something in his life, something in his wealth, something among his positions was weighing him down. And as he's inquiring from Jesus about how to be a follower, to achieve eternal life, the answer is made clear that Jesus says there's some things here that aren't essential, that do not need to make this trip. And that's a hard thing to hear. That's a hard thing to try to decide on the side of the trail. It was hard for that man, which is why he ultimately walked away from Jesus grieving, because whatever it was painful to think of letting go. And I have no doubt that for those settlers heading west 150 years ago, that as they had to make decisions about leaving things on the plains of Texas, it was hard for them as well. Now, to this day, when we say that we're going to be followers of Jesus, there is an understanding that to some degree, the who and what of who we are, or who we think we are, takes a back seat and a secondary role to our new primary identity as followers of Jesus. And that becomes the most important piece. In the Gospels, as Jesus calls disciples, they are no longer fishermen, they are no longer tax collectors. He's no longer a carpenter himself. For us, it might mean, well, we're not entirely teachers, or we're not entirely lawyers, we're not entirely priests. We are something else as we are pioneers following Jesus through the wilderness to the promised land that God has always intended for us. And really, the only promise beyond the destination is that the journey is going to be hard. Jesus says it again and again, that the way of the cross is not easy. Now, when I was a kid and I played the Oregon Trail game, one of the first things you have to decide is which character you want to be. And you got 3 choices. You could be the banker, you could be the carpenter, or you could be the farmer. And it's taken me a couple of decades to realize that if you wanted the highest chance of reaching Oregon, you really needed to choose the banker. Now, I always thought farmers are good with animals and maybe finding food and helping to be resourceful along the side of the trail, or carpenters because if your wagon breaks or the axle gets bent or whatever, you can deal with that along the trail. But no, even the creator of the game admits your highest likelihood of reaching Oregon is to start with the banker, because the banker starts the game with the most resources. So the banker can buy the food and buy the equipment and buy the medicine and buy the boxes of bullets and fix things that break along the way better than some of the other options that the characters have. And that shouldn't really come as a surprise, right? That's still the way it works today, not just in games, but in the real life. You know, we have to have enough to get the basics to get through life. And so those of us who have, not necessarily that we have to be bankers, but we just have to have enough to be able to make those choices and do those sorts of things. And for all the similarities between the first century Palestine mindset of pioneering, or the 19th century Western idea of pioneering, or what may be real for us in the 21st century today, Jesus' idea about the journey he's leading seems to be the complete opposite. That what he's saying, in essence, is those who have the least are likely to make it the furthest. Which is just another realization that for many of us sitting in this church or watching online who have more than enough, we wonder how we can then be saved, how we get through the eye of that proverbial needle. And we hear the question the disciples asked, who can be saved, echoing through the lives of all the pioneers who have taken up that journey ever since. Now, Jesus doesn't have an easy answer for us. And I don't have one as a preacher either. We've tried over the decades and the centuries to try to sidestep teachings like this in the gospel, but sometimes Jesus is just difficult, and there is no way around one of his difficult lessons. We have to go through it. We have to get bogged down in it. We have to strain with it and wrestle with it before we can finally make our way through. And I'd like to think that there's subtlety in here somewhere, that there's degrees that we can find that tell us that it doesn't necessarily apply to us literally, that we can go through this life with some things, that we don't have to get rid of everything. I know, having packed up and moved my house multiple times, I'm definitely closer to the lots of things end of the spectrum than the few things end of the spectrum. I'm guessing, again, that I'm not the only one here in that category. So there is a question for us then to be asked: is this merely a warning not to be weighed down by the things of our life, or is there a stronger message for us in there? How worried should we be as we read this lesson that the church has wrestled with for so long? Because I don't think Jesus wants us to despair. I don't think Jesus wants us to get so frustrated and grieve so much that we turn around and go the other way. I don't think Jesus is a stern trail boss who says my way or the highway. There's other parts of the gospel to tell us he's looking for more. Because Jesus, above all else, loves us. And loves us in this context. The way that we know that is because in Mark's gospel, the only person who it is said that Jesus explicitly loves is this man who kneels before him, who asks what he needs to do to inherit eternal life. And if you remember from when Deacon Becky read it, it says Jesus loved him and then spoke and said, "You lack one thing." He says it out of love to point out what this man was struggling with. And the same is true for us, that even in the midst of a hard teaching, it's not out of anger or disappointment or spite, it's out of love that we have to wrestle with it. And it's clear that Jesus wants us to journey together, wants us along for the ride, wants us to be pioneer-spirited people in the gospel, and to share with others, to lighten the burdens that others have, because we know on this side of heaven that often the people who are weighed down the most are the people who already have the least. There is a discernment process each of us has to go through to figure out if this passage is troubling to us or not. What is absolutely necessary? How much is enough in our life to make the journey that we're on? And it's going to be a slightly different answer for all of us. And how we know that there's some work to do here is that if we hear Jesus talking to us and not to this man in the gospel, suggesting what we might do or what we might give up or where we might go, and it causes us grief to think about doing it, all that says is we're still on some sort of spiritual journey and we're still making choices about how we follow Jesus on the way. I don't begin to believe that Jesus wanted every single person to sell everything they had, but I can't say that he didn't mean it either. The gospel never tells us what happens to the man who goes away grieving, just that he left because he was sad from all the possessions that he had. It may be that he went and got over his grief and divested of all the things that were the block and was able to be a follower of Jesus and understand what that lesson was that he had to learn. We do a little bit better in the show 1883 because that musician with the piano also gets a choice from the trail boss when he says you can unload this wagon and you can travel lightly to the place you're trying to get to, or you can turn around now and stay here in Texas. We don't ultimately know from the show if that musician ever makes it all the way to Oregon, but we do know that he makes a choice because he chooses the route and the identity of a pioneer. He chooses the journey and to follow to the place he thinks he is being called to go. And his beloved piano stayed in that Texas field.